Imagine rolling into a country with the largest army on Earth, expecting a quick 6-month victory, only to trigger a decade-long meat grinder. Welcome to Afghanistan, the graveyard of empires. Today, we are not just looking at a war, but examining the anatomy of a superpower's collapse. The Soviet Union didn't just lose to guerrilla fighters. They destroyed themselves through 5 catastrophic, system-breaking mistakes. Let's rewind to December 1979. The Cold War is at its peak. The Kremlin looks at its southern border and panics. Afghanistan, a socialist ally, is spiraling into absolute chaos. Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev and his inner circle make a fateful decision. They need to stabilize the region, remove the unpredictable Afghan president, and leave. Enter Operation Storm 333. On December 27, elite Soviet Spetsnaz and KGB operatives storm the Tajbek Palace in Kabul. It plays out like an action movie. The operation is a flawless tactical success. President Hafizullah Amin is eliminated, and a new, Soviet loyal leader is installed almost overnight. Easy, right? Back in Moscow, champagne glasses clink. The Soviet leadership genuinely believes this will be a quick, clean stabilization mission, a 6-month holiday, tops. Which brings us to fatal mistake number 1, colossal political delusion. The Kremlin completely misunderstood the complex tribal reality of the Afghan people. They assumed the Afghan population would welcome the Red Army as socialist liberators. Instead, the sudden arrival of 80,000 foreign troops achieved the impossible. It instantly united dozens of fiercely independent, historically divided mountain tribes against a single, common enemy. The invaders had just united their own opposition. The Soviets didn't realize they had just stepped onto a geopolitical landmine. They replaced a localized rebellion with a nationwide holy war, the jihad. But the political blindness was just the beginning. As massive armored columns poured across the Friendship Bridge, they brought the wrong military doctrine. The Red Army was built, trained, and equipped for World War III on the flat, open plains of Europe against NATO forces. They were absolutely not prepared for what awaited them in the towering, unforgiving heights of the Hindu Kush. The geography of death awaited. The Soviet war machine was an absolute behemoth, but it was entirely designed to fight across the flat, predictable plains of Central Europe. Which brings us to fatal mistake number 2, the terrain trap. Afghanistan is a fortress of stone, heavily defined by the Hindu Kush. Take the pride of the Red Army, their formidable tanks. They were built to rush across open fields, not navigate narrow, jagged mountain gorges. Here is the fatal design flaw. In a steep valley, Soviet tank cannons simply could not elevate high enough to target the cliffs above. Mujahideen fighters realized they just needed to sit a few hundred feet up. The multi-million-dollar tanks were suddenly reduced to very expensive metal coffins. And if the bullets didn't get them, the environment would. Freezing temperatures and severe altitude sickness began devastating the unacclimated young conscripts. But fighting in the mountains reveals an even bigger structural flaw. An army marches on its stomach, and supplying this army was geometrically impossible. Welcome to fatal mistake number 3, a logistical nightmare. Supplying 80,000 troops in a landlocked, mountainous country is an engineer's worst nightmare. The entire Soviet invasion relied almost exclusively on a single, precarious lifeline, the infamous Saling Pass, soaring nearly 4,000 meters high into the clouds. This meant massive, slow-moving supply columns stretching for miles, crawling single file along narrow cliff edges with absolutely no room to maneuver. It was a tactical disaster waiting to happen. If just one truck at the front broke down, the entire convoy behind it was completely paralyzed. The Mujahideen perfected the art of the convoy ambush. They didn't need a massive army, they just needed patience and the high ground. Their strategy was brutally simple. Destroy the lead vehicle, destroy the rear vehicle, and suddenly, a mile-long supply chain is locked in a box. The narrow mountain roads became absolute kill zones. The Soviet lifeline was effectively choked off, bleeding their resources dry day after day. This geographical stranglehold meant that sheer numbers and overwhelming firepower were practically useless. The superpower was literally fighting the mountains, and losing. As the Soviet economy slowly bled out on the jagged rocks, the frustrated generals in Moscow doubled down. They deployed the only strategy they knew. Welcome to fatal mistake number 4, using conventional World War II era tactics to fight a highly mobile, deeply entrenched, Asymmetrical guerrilla war. The Red Army's military doctrine relied entirely on massive armored pushes and overwhelming artillery barrages. Think of it as a giant, incredibly heavy sledgehammer. But trying to crush the agile mujahideen with this massive sledgehammer was like trying to swat a swarm of angry bees. It was entirely useless. The Afghan fighters didn't hold territory. They would strike a supply convoy with lightning speed, and then simply melt back into the civilian population. This psychological warfare completely broke the young Soviet conscripts. They found themselves shooting at shadows, terrified of an invisible enemy that could be anyone, anywhere. Frustrated by these ghostly ambushes, the Soviet High Command made a brutal pivot. If they couldn't separate the fighters from the civilians, they would eliminate both. They unleashed a devastating, scorched earth campaign. Entire farming villages, crops, and ancient irrigation systems were systematically wiped off the map to deny the guerrillas sanctuary. And leading this campaign of absolute destruction was the Soviets' ultimate weapon of terror, the legendary Mi-24 Hind attack helicopter. Essentially a heavily armored flying tank. The Hind was practically invincible to small arms fire. It rained destruction from above, temporarily shifting the bloody momentum of the war back to the Red Army. But this brutal tactic completely backfired politically. The sheer destruction didn't pacify the country, it triggered one of the largest mass migrations in modern human history. Nearly 6 million Afghan civilians fled across the rocky borders into neighboring Pakistan and Iran, creating massive, sprawling, and deeply desperate refugee camps. Instead of crushing the rebellion, the Soviets had just built the ultimate recruitment center. Grieving, displaced young men with nothing left to lose were eager for revenge. Foreign funds and radical ideologies began flooding into these camps. A localized rebellion was rapidly mutating into a globally funded, heavily armed holy war. The invincible flying tanks had created a generation of fearless fighters. And very soon, these fighters were about to receive a deadly, game-changing package from the CIA. Enter Operation Cyclone. The CIA, secretly working with Pakistan and Saudi Arabia, began funneling billions of dollars in advanced weaponry directly to the Mujahideen. But out of all the weapons supplied, one single piece of technology completely altered the trajectory of the war, the FIM-92 Stinger surface-to-air missile. This wasn't just any rocket, it was a highly advanced, shoulder-fired, heat-seeking missile that could turn an untrained fighter into a lethal anti-aircraft battery. Remember the invincible Mi-24 Hind helicopters that dominated the skies and terrified the Afghan fighters? Their reign of absolute terror was about to end abruptly. With the Stinger, fighters could effortlessly lock onto the hot exhaust of the Soviet helicopters. In a flash of fire, the hunters became the hunted. The impact was immediate and devastating. Soviet aircraft were falling from the sky at an alarming rate. The Red Army had lost its air superiority. To avoid the deadly Stingers, Soviet pilots were forced to fly at extreme altitudes, rendering their bombing runs completely inaccurate and virtually useless. And without close air support to protect him from above, the vulnerable Soviet supply convoys winding through the mountain passes were left completely defenseless. The kill zones we talked about earlier, they turned into absolute massacres. The Soviet war machine was being systematically dismantled piece by piece. Which leads us to fatal mistake number 5, the Bleeding Empire. The war was no longer just a foreign policy failure, it was destroying the Soviet Union from the inside out. The human cost was becoming impossible to hide. Thousands of young conscripts were returning home in sealed zinc coffins, grimly known as Cargo 200. Despite strict state media censorship painting a picture of victory, grieving mothers and families across the Soviet Union began to realize the horrifying truth of the Afghan trap. Financially, the war was a black hole. It was costing the already struggling Soviet economy billions of rubles every single year, violently accelerating its overall collapse. By the mid-1980s, a new leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, took power. He looked at the endless Afghan conflict and famously described it as a bleeding wound. But a bleeding wound of this magnitude cannot simply be patched up. The infection had already spread deep into the veins of the Soviet Union itself. By 1988, the reality was undeniable. The Soviet Union could no longer afford the financial or political cost of the war. They had to get out. But a superpower cannot simply run away. They needed a diplomatic smokescreen. Enter the Geneva Accords of 1988, a face-saving exit strategy. Moscow officially agreed to withdraw its troops. essentially abandoning the Afghan communist government they had spent a decade, and billions of rubles, trying to protect. Now came the agonizing logistical nightmare of pulling over 100,000 soldiers back through the exact same deadly mountain passes they arrived in. The Mujahideen, flush with CIA weapons, watched from the high ground. While some local ceasefires were negotiated, the retreat remained incredibly tense and dangerous. Compare the arrogant, polished invaders of 1979 to the exhausted, traumatized survivors packing their bags 10 years later. The contrast was staggering. What was supposed to be a quick, clean 6-month stabilization mission had devolved into a grueling 3,300-day nightmare. The final receipt for this brief intervention was catastrophic. It cost the Soviet Union an estimated $50 billion, bankrupting their already fragile economy. But the human cost was even worse. Over 15,000 Soviet soldiers were officially dead, and more than 1 million Afghan civilians had perished. Finally, in early 1989, the long convoys began their final march home, crossing the ironically named Friendship Bridge over the Amu Darya River. On February 15, General Boris Gromov, the last Soviet commander, walked across the bridge. He famously declared that not a single Soviet soldier was left behind him. The war was officially over. Moscow had finally stopped the bleeding, but the damage inflicted on the empire's foundation was terminal. The humiliating defeat in the Afghan mountains completely shattered the greatest illusion of the Cold War, the absolute invincibility of the Red Army. Suddenly, satellite states across Eastern Europe looked at Moscow and realized the giant Soviet bear was actually exhausted, broke, and vulnerable. The dominoes were set in motion. The systemic failure in the Afghan mountains would soon echo across the world, straight to the concrete of the Berlin Wall. But while the West was busy celebrating the end of the Cold War, the true cost of this proxy battle was just beginning to unfold back in Asia. The Soviet Union had left behind a country that was utterly annihilated. Afghanistan's infrastructure, its agriculture, and its entire modern society had been bombed into the Stone Age. And hiding beneath the soil was a terrifying parting gift. The Red Army had scattered an estimated 10 to 15 million landmines across the rural countryside. These weren't just anti-tank mines. Millions of them were designed specifically to maim civilians, creating a multi-generational crisis that continues to kill innocent people to this day. Meanwhile, what did the United States and its allies do once the Soviets retreated? They essentially packed up and left. The objective was achieved. The Cold War was won. Funding from Operation Cyclone dried up almost overnight. The deeply traumatized, heavily armed country was completely abandoned to figure out its own future in the rubble. Remember how the Soviet invasion accidentally united dozens of divided mountain tribes into a single, unstoppable force? Well, without a common enemy, that unity instantly shattered. Afghanistan immediately plunged into a brutal, multi-sided civil war. Different Mujahideen factions, now led by powerful warlords, turned their American and Soviet weapons against each other. The capital city of Kabul, which had ironically survived most of the Soviet occupation relatively intact, was absolutely devastated by rival warlords fighting for the throne. It's the ultimate tragic irony. The global superpowers had treated Afghanistan like a giant chessboard, but when the game was over, they left the pieces to burn. This absolute vacuum of power, combined with endless stockpiles of weapons and a heavily radicalized population, created the perfect breeding ground for extreme ideologies. Out of the horrific chaos of the Civil War, a new faction composed of religious students and former fighters began to rise. They promised order at any cost. They called themselves the Taliban, and they would soon take over the country using the very same military hardware and training networks left behind by the superpowers. Furthermore, the global networks of foreign fighters built during the Soviet War didn't just disappear. They evolved. They found a new leader, and formed a group called Al-Qaeda. The Soviet Union had collapsed. The United States claimed victory. But as the 1990s rolled on, the graveyard of empires was quietly preparing its next chapter. A chapter that would change the world in 2001. The Soviet disaster in Afghanistan didn't just end the Cold War. It completely tore up and rewrote the global military textbook for every major superpower. For decades, the world's greatest militaries were built exclusively around the concept of massive, conventional clashes of heavy armor and millions of uniformed men. But watching an invincible industrial giant slowly bleed to death against mountain rebels sent terrifying shockwaves through military academies from Washington to London. The first and most bitter lesson the world learned was the absolute, undeniable dominance of asymmetrical warfare in the modern era. It definitively proved that a vastly inferior force could defeat a high-tech superpower simply by refusing to fight on the giant's terms. Technology has severe, physical limits. The most advanced satellites, radars, and attack helicopters are effectively blinded by extreme geography and deep cave networks. The second major lesson was a brutal reminder about force projection. You can have the best guns on Earth, but if you can't feed your troops, you lose. If your entire logistical network relies on a single, vulnerable mountain choke point, your multi-billion-dollar military is nothing more than a paper tiger waiting to starve. But perhaps the most profound lesson was deeply psychological. The doctrine of hearts and minds. You simply cannot win an insurgency through sheer firepower alone. The Soviet scorched earth policy proved a fatal paradox. Overwhelming brutality and civilian casualties actually act as the greatest recruitment tool for the enemy. Every village destroyed and every innocent killed mathematically multiplied the resistance. It turned localized political disputes into inescapable, multi-generational blood feuds. This birthed the modern military understanding that in a guerrilla war, the battlefield isn't the physical territory or the mountains, the battlefield is the population itself. Furthermore, the conflict demonstrated the terrifying, unyielding power of weaponized ideology. You can shoot a soldier, you can bomb a tank, but you cannot shoot an idea. The old rules of engagement were officially dead. The era of clean, predictable, state-on-state warfare was rapidly coming to a chaotic, asymmetrical close. The ghosts of the Hindu Kush would force every modern military to rethink their entire existence, their training, and their technology for the 21st century. So, looking back at the ashes of the 20th century, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan stands as the ultimate masterclass in how not to fight a war. They completely ignored the complex political reality of the tribes, blindly driving their heavy European armor straight into the ultimate, inescapable terrain trap. They choked to death on their own impossible, single-lane supply lines, and stubbornly tried to swat agile guerrilla fighters with a giant, useless sledgehammer. And finally, they let national pride and geopolitical panic blind them, allowing a localized proxy war to slowly bleed their empire's fragile economy completely dry. This catastrophic, decade-long failure cemented Afghanistan's terrifying reputation. It fully popularized the ominous nickname, the Graveyard of Empires. But historically speaking, this dramatic title is slightly misleading. Empires rarely die strictly on the battlefields of Afghan soil. Instead, the massive financial drain, the devastating loss of military prestige, and the domestic political outrage act as a fatal poison, eventually destroying the empire from within. This was proven true on December 25, 1991, just over 2 years after the final Soviet soldier retreated across the bridge. The Soviet Union officially ceased to exist. But while empires rise and fall in the history books, the true, enduring tragedy belongs to the Afghan people, who were left to navigate the apocalyptic wreckage alone. Through it all, the towering peaks of the Hindu Kush remained exactly as they always have. Indifferent, unmoving, and utterly unconquered. You would think the world would look closely at this catastrophic Soviet disaster, take detailed notes, and learn a permanent, historical lesson. But history has a very dark sense of humor, because just a decade later, another confident global superpower would find itself looking at the exact same map, armed with brand new, 21st century technology, but facing the exact same geography, the exact same resilient fighters, and the exact same impossible choices. It forces us to ask one chilling final question: does superior technology ever truly guarantee victory? Or is human nature simply doomed to repeat its geographical mistakes? What do you think? Let us know in the comments below. If you want to explore more fatal mistakes in military history, hit that subscribe button. Until next time.